now it is my great honor. Please join me in welcoming inventor, deep sea explorer, environmentalist, sustainable business owner, artist, and dreamer, and Oscar-winning filmmaker, and newly minted New Zealander, James Cameron.
Thank you.
Now, welcome to, we are absolutely delighted to have you here tonight.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
Is everyone in the audience. So we're going to start with a broad question.
Okay.
Now, you have seen more of the ocean than most anyone in this room has or might ever do. What about it still...
Well, maybe not Admiral Hammond.
Okay, fair. Sorry, Admiral. What about the ocean still surprises you?
You know, the purpose of exploration is to be surprised, you know, to see something that you couldn't imagine. You know, Jacques Cousteau had a pretty famous expression. He said, if we knew what was there, we wouldn't have to go. So you go to bear witness to the wonders of nature, and if you're not surprised, you know, what's the point? You can't predict what you're going to see. Sometimes you can. You know, if you go to a hydrothermal vent site, you know you're going to see certain types of species that can live in the, you know, a couple of inches away from water that's hot enough to boil lead, and on the other side of them it's actually freezing cold, and they somehow thrive in this environment. So you can know sometimes what you're going to see and still be amazed when you actually witness it. You know, I call it bearing witness. To me, one of the key criteria for exploration is to go yourself and see it with your own eyes, to project yourself physically into that place, and then, you know, thinking as a storyteller, get the shot, you know, bring it back, tell the story, share it with the world. You know, there's 8 billion people on the planet. Only a very microscopic subset of that get to go scuba diving, let's say, and see it with their own eyes at shallow depths, and then an even tinier fraction of that get to see it from the porthole of a submersible. So we have to bring that back. But in terms of surprise, to me, it's about wonder. It's about standing in awe of something that has been there for hundreds of millions, if not billions of years. Hydrothermal vents, for example, these crazy deep ocean communities, bacterial mats that might have looked very much like that 3.5 billion years ago as life emerged on this planet. You know, it's not just about being so remote from the surface and being remote spatially from the rest of humanity. It's also feeling what a tiny sliver of time we understand, and the deep time that preceded it, you know, biologically and geologically, when you go to some of these really deep ocean sites.
And you've been there, and I'm going to plug for the museum here. We do have a hydrothermal event in the exhibition.
You do.
You can check it out afterwards.
Yeah.
Now, despite all of your documentaries and expeditions, you're also part owner of a submersible company. So, what do you see as the future of ocean exploration?
I think that, well, first of all, you have to understand that ocean exploration includes science, includes discovery. It also includes visiting and seeing, even if you're not a scientist. And you know, the tragedy of ocean exploration is it's vastly underfunded compared to space exploration. I love space exploration as well, but the oceans are what keep us alive, what keep the climate moderated, generate the oxygen. The ocean is our beating heart of our planet, and we need to do as much as we can with limited money. So scientists will tell you, I can get much more bang for my limited research bucks with a robot, with an ROV, with an AUV, something like that. I love robotics, and I think all of that stuff is very important. I'm going to return to that in a second. But I also think it's important for human beings to go, and so human-occupied vehicles are still important. They're not as important scientifically. They're more important kind of symbolically and in terms of the narrative, right? We feel if we're following somebody who's going in a sub and exploring and seeing something, their wonder becomes our wonder. their story becomes our story. We go along with them. We sit at their shoulder. And I think one of the things that's going to open up over the next few years is a shared immersive experience. As more people will be adopting AR and VR, if we could pipe out live via fiber optic and via satellite the exploration activities, either of robotics or of people in vehicles, and people can ride along as students, as science observers, and so on, just as interested parties. That, I think, is a big part of it, that if we make it more participatory for people. They see it at the same exact moment that the scientist sees it, or the observer, the geologist, or whatever. They see it at the same moment. And it's also interactive, so you can look around, you can look down, you may even be seeing something the scientist isn't seeing that's happening over there. I think that could be a big part of it. The other thing we got to remember is the ocean, we know it's 2/3 of the surface area of the planet, but we don't think volumetrically. So when you start thinking that in places it's 11,000 meters deep, you start thinking of that volume and you realize the true vastness of it. And so when we look at the atmosphere from orbit with satellites, we see meteorological conditions evolving in real time. We can predict when the rain's going to hit here. We have Doppler radar. We have all these ways of looking at the atmosphere and all of its dynamics at all of its different levels. We have nothing like that in the ocean. We have some time series study of some ocean currents here and there. You may look at a place on the ocean map and say, what's the last data available on this surface current? When did they have? Well, they had a drifter there in 1995. We got 110 days of contiguous data. Oh, bravo! We have microsecond data on the atmosphere every single day, and we don't have that same picture of the ocean because remote sensing from above, you can't see through the water column. You've got to put instrumentation down in the water. So I'm seeing swarm robotics being a big factor. Autonomous vehicles, lightweight, low-cost, high-sensitivity vehicles that can go down, surface, report, and we start to get more of a real-time picture. And AI is going to play a big role in that, right? We got to make these things smarter so they can accomplish tasks without direct human oversight. So we need these low-cost, rapidly deployable vehicles that can fill in a real-time picture of the ocean, understand where the biomass is, understand where the carbon is going, right? So we won't understand climate completely until we understand the carbon flux. What's being pulled out of the atmosphere by the plankton that are making our oxygen. 2/3 of our oxygen comes from the ocean. Everybody talks about the lungs of the planet being the rainforest. That's a bit romanticized because it's really largely majorities coming from the oceans, and we're killing all that stuff off. So there's so much we have to understand that will ultimately put constraints on how badly we can damage it, and hopefully that happens before we damage it irreparably, and we're starting to approach those kinds of tipping points now. So that's where I see. I mean, you probably wanted a more romanticized answer. We're gonna go down in mini subs and find giant squid. It's gonna be real. Hey, if I believed I could get mugged by a giant squid in a sub, that would be the happiest day of my life. I'd hang steaks all over that sucker,
You said exactly what we need, which is low-cost solutions for understanding the ocean. But there are many ways to understand the ocean.
Oh, that's for sure. Look, I wondered if I could jump in a little bit about First Nations Agency, and the resonance that First Nations people have of thinking of the ocean as a living entity, as having sentience, even like the Wanganui River in New Zealand.
In New Zealand, right? They gave it personhood.
Exactly.
In a parliament, act of parliament, yeah.
I know. I mean, you've actually worked with lots of First Nations communities: Canada, New Zealand, Hawaii, Australia.
Canada, yeah.
How do we keep
Amazon.
Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah, keeping that momentum going. How do we do that?
Yeah. Yeah, so we have the Avatar Alliance Foundation when Avatar became this massive hit, and it was talking about very clearly imperialism, colonialism, displacement and impact on indigenous culture. I was like, okay, I really got to give something back here. And plus, we were besieged by requests from indigenous leadership around the world to come and understand their specific plight. And the crazy thing was, whenever I met with somebody, they always said, "You wrote that movie about us." And I always said yes, because in the generic sense, it's true. It's true. You know, first of all, I did a lot of research on a lot of different communities and sort of just threw it all into a blender and did a made-up one. But the problems are the same. You know, it's extraction, it's expansion, it's industrialization, it's deforestation, loss of habitat, you know, loss of traditional lands, and all of it's the same. It's the same everywhere. And if it doesn't even go all the way to borderline genocide, right? So you know, over the years since then, you know, through the Avatar Alliance Foundation and a lot of our efforts, we've gotten involved all over the world and tried to support. We don't want to sort of take over and Bigfoot anything. We just want to quietly in the background just kind of support what people are doing for themselves and help raise their voices, you know. And some have more agency in their governments than others. So like you take the Maori, for example, they're represented in Parliament and so on, and they're well down the path in reparations and things like that. And so you see what we've tried to do is maybe broker leadership meetings, you know, with, let's say, First Nations people coming to New Zealand and so on, and just sharing, like, how do we do it? How do we get the agency we need in business, economically, politically, and so on? And, you know, everybody's issues are different in the details, but they're the same in the broad strokes, you know. And so that's been a real journey for me. And I had a kind of epiphany today, which I was the wrong guy to make Avatar. It should have been an indigenous filmmaker, you know. I mean, I got to make it because I had made Titanic, you know, which is pretty much a white story. It's not a colonialism story. So I made a lot of money on that movie, so then they trusted me. You know, I felt compelled to make that movie. I think we did a pretty good job. But the point is, we need to empower, you know, indigenous filmmakers to speak for themselves and have that voice, because it's so much more direct and it's so much more authentic. Right? You know, I was telling a made up story of a bunch of made-up people on another planet, right? Best of intentions, but still, we need to have that kind of reach and that kind of impact with indigenous filmmakers. And, you know, so that is also part of my mandate, which is to, you know, pass the baton to the storytellers who are the closest to the story that needs to be told.
Yeah, that's what we were thinking. I mean, those great journeys of migrations of people, everyone's indigenous to somewhere if you go back.
Well, yeah, if you go back far enough.
You know,
well, we're all African if you go back far enough. You know, so, that's what's, yeah. You know, human beings are all about moving.
Yeah.
You know, the second we went bipedal and we could walk and we could carry surplus food and weapons and babies, we were gone. We were out of the house. You know, see ya, Mom. You know, and then we just walked everywhere around the planet and sailed. I mean, you think about the Polynesian migrations, you know, I mean, they didn't have compasses and instruments and GPS and all that. They were doing it with star sights and just, you know, the navigation knowledge of the Polynesians and Micronesians is almost unfathomable, and it's a lost art. You know, there's Nainoa Thompson, who's a fellow explorer in residence at National Geographic. He was able to resurrect some of that ancient Polynesian knowledge by using the planetarium in Honolulu and painstakingly over a period of years reconstructing how they used the appearance of the first time of the year a certain star arose, and that told them kind of what longitude they were on and all that sort of thing. He was able to figure a lot of it out because it was a dying art, and that's the thing that's so heartbreaking about indigenous traditions and languages and so on, that they're dying out. The last practitioners, you know, we have to preserve that.
Speaking about journeys, when you were a kid, your mom used to drive 80 kilometers to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto to take you to a museum so that you could see Dr. Joe McInnes's
Well, we didn't go there to see that.
Oh, really?
But that was an inspiration, and that was a turning point for me, right?
Yeah.
No, she used to take, I mean, my mom was nuts. She'd say, okay, you can only learn so much in school. Let's go take a geology course. So I'm spending my weeknights in a geology class for adults. It's like
your mom.
You know, at the age of 10, it's like, sure, Mom, you know, but I learned a lot of geology. I still remember my Mohs hardness scale from that, right? And then, you know, let's go to the Royal Ontario Museum for the day. I'm like, okay, I take my sketch pad and I'm drawing dinosaur bones and, you know, Roman helmets and things like that. And that's when I saw Dr. Joe McInnes. He was one of the top oceanographers in Canada back in the heyday of the 70s, 80s, 90s for him. is actually a dive physiologist, and he learned how to dive under the ice and for how people could live in habitats under the ocean in saturation for long periods of time. And he had built a habitat that had been used, and it was sitting out in front of the Royal Ontario Museum. And it was one of those weird moments where I walked out and I went, that's a habitat. You know, I was 14, I think, 13 or 14, and I just started to draw it. And I drew it in such detail because I wanted to build my own, basically, and live in it. I think the sketch is I think the actual sketch itself is in the exhibit. So I thought, all right, I got to write this guy and find out how you do this, you know. So I wrote Joe McGinnis. We're still pals. He's in his mid-80s now, and we're still we're the closest of friends, believe it or not. But he wrote me back, a 14-year-old kid, and said, well, you know, here's how you do this, here's how you do that, and you know, you got to use acrylic for the windows. I said, where do you get that? So he wrote to Rom and Haas, which was an acrylic supplier, and they sent me a sample of a piece of 1-inch acrylic that I could use for a window.
Good on him.
And I'm like, well, I got the window, the rest is going to be pretty easy.
Get building.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So there's lots of influences and inspirations throughout your life. You know, who should we be following now? What innovators, what influencers for the ocean should we all know about?
Well, when we did this Ocean Explorer series, we looked around for some of, you know, I called them the young hot scientists, which is a joke, but it was, you know, who is infectious in their ability to express their scientific passion, right? Because we wanted to make science and exploration aspirational for, you know, let's say kids in high school are thinking, wow, I could have a career in engineering, I could get to do that. There was a young guy. Eric Stackpole, who was building his own ROVs. He had this company that made low-cost ROVs, and you know, we had made a deal with him to get 1,000 of them and distribute them to high schools. And National Geographic funded that. You know, they weren't very expensive, and kids could go explore a lake or a river or the ocean if they live near the ocean. And you know, so look, there are young innovators and entrepreneurs coming up all the time. You know, unfortunately, a lot of the best engineering minds get sucked in by the oil industry. You know, extraction, right? It's always got the bucks, right? But there are enough people that are true to their spirit and their principles that, you know, that exploration and science are the most important thing. And there's so much we've got to find out. You know, we're just now starting to find out for sure something that we intuitively knew, which is that whales are intelligent, sentient beings that happen to have the misfortune of sharing the planet with us, and that they have culture. They're often kind of matriarchal, and the mothers hand down culture. If you look at orcas around the world, you know, Patagonia, British Columbia, New Zealand, the Azores, orcas all have different strategies in different places. They're not like wolves. Like you take a wolf in North America and a wolf in Siberia, it does the same thing. Orcas don't. They adapt to the particular food supply. Their hunting strategies are completely different in different places, and the mothers teach it to the kids. And they go on training exercises, and you can see them in Patagonia teaching their kids how to go up on the beach and grab a seal and make sure they get back in the water, because whales out of the water don't do so well, right? And so, you know, we're starting to understand that they have language. They just recently discovered that the sperm whale clicks, which they call codas, the click series, every click, when you unpack it, is a microburst of incredible amounts of information, and that they have vowels and they have syntactic structure and so on, and their ability to communicate information. We used to think they just kind of went click, click. And it's like, okay, how much can they possibly be saying to each other? And it turns out it's like, there's so much information in that click when you unpack it that they're actually saying a lot. You know, and I think that AI is going to give us the opportunity to, if we can get a big enough data set from these communications, and if we can relate it to some sort of visual observation of what they're doing, we're going to be able to figure out what they're saying to each other and maybe even talk to them.
Okay, everyone, James Cameron said we're going to be unable to understand whales.
We're going to sing whale, just like Ellen DeGeneres. Oh, I speak whale. Yeah.
That's a singing movie. That's a good.
There's a movie there.
Yeah. Coming back to Sydney, I mean, before you came to Australia, how did you imagine it, and what was it like when you actually came here? Where did you go, or Who did you meet?
My first time in Australia was in '94. I'd been down in New Zealand. I actually went to the South Pole, and it was staged out of New Zealand. When I got back to New Zealand, I met these two Australian girls who were part of a rock show. And they said, hey, come with us, we'll show you around. I'm like, yeah, baby. So I quite liked it. And it was the Sydney area and around. And no, I really liked Australia. I mean, look, Australia's kind of legendary, right? And so all the imagery and, Ayers Rock and, kangaroos silhouetted against the sunset and all that from the Qantas ads. But, I really enjoyed it. When Ronnie Allam, who's the co-designer of the sub, Ron, are you here? Where are you, buddy? He's right there. He said, let's build the sub in Sydney. I said, Ronnie, I have an entire workshop in California that I've worked on for years to build the sub. He said, yeah, but I live in Sydney. And my wife's going to be really mad if I go to California for a long time. So it's really Ron and Yvette that got the sub-project to here. But Ron made an excellent case. He said, I know a lot of young engineers that just came out of school at Sydney University that were doing robotics and battery systems and things like that. And he pitched a kind of a young team that didn't know what they didn't know. You know what I mean? And we wanted to build a sub that was pretty radical and out of the box. And so we thought, all right, let's not get people that have built human-occupied subs before and are bound by the kind of, legacy engineering principles. Ronnie and I knew enough about subs to be able to herd the cats in the right direction. But let's think outside the box. And so Ron was able to assemble a team here. The very first dive was at Garden Island in Sydney Harbor. It was 1 meter of depth. All we had to do was get the communications transducers. We also didn't know how deep the water was. We thought we might hit bottom before we got under. Get the transducers under the water and see if we could talk to the sub. Didn't work. The first dive was a disaster, but we learned what the sub needed, and we pulled it out of the water. We fixed it over the next few days, and then we did our next dive up at Jarvis Bay. I think that was, 20 meters, something like that, which is the deepest spot we could find in Jarvis Bay. And the sub worked perfectly. And the next dive after that was in Papua New Guinea to 1,000 meters. And everybody was like, we can't go right to 1,000 meters. I said, guys, we designed this thing to go to 11,000 meters. If it can't go to 1,000 meters, it ain't going to make it to 11,000 meters. So we had a very successful 1,000-meter dive, and then really the wind was in our sails at that point. The confidence level got very high that we actually knew what we were doing, because that's a serious sub. Yeah. Most commercial subs that either sort of billionaire yacht subs or that are used by science and commercial diving operations, they'll go to 1,000 meters, like the typical acrylic, hulled subs that you see. It's a rare handful. I think there's only 3 or 4 certified subs in the world that can go to the 4,000 to 6,000 meter range. I mean, it's very, very elite group at that point. And then there's only 2 subs in the world that can go deeper than that. And one of them sitting in the other room.
And you can all see it.
That we know of. Admiral, you guys got something?
Not in this venue yet. There was a book I read about you, The Futurist, by I think Rebecca Keegan.
Rebecca, yeah.
In which she said
it's the least egregious of the books written about me.
I'm so glad I missed out. But you said in it that ocean is an alien world that you can reach.
Right. That goes back to when the Cousteau stuff was appearing, and I was a huge science fiction fan, so I'm reading all these books about amazing other planets and other ecosystems and that sort of thing, and I thought, okay, wait a minute, I'm very unlikely candidate for an astronaut, and plus they're not going to have interplanetary, let alone interstellar travel for hundreds of years. But there's an alien world I can go to by learning how to scuba dive. This was my thought process when I was 16. And so I just pestered my parents until they found a scuba class, which was, we were living in Canada at the border, was across on the US side in Buffalo. So I learned scuba diving in Buffalo, New York in February. There was no open water dive. It was in the pool, and it was an all-adult class. I was the only kid, and I was a skinny little kid. The tank was probably weighed as much as I did, and went straight to the bottom. But I did it. I passed the class. Then I didn't have anybody to dive with because I lived in Niagara Falls on the Canadian side. There was only one scuba diver in the whole city, and that was the guy that worked for the fire department pulling the bodies out of the water. I wasn't going to go talk to him. My first open water dive was in Chippewa Creek, which is a river. They call it a creek, but it was a full-on river. And my dad tied a rope around my waist. So he was my buddy standing on the dock with a rope. Good safety plan. The rope, there was a 4-knot current. The rope wound around every pier piling that was submerged in the river. I had to untie myself to survive.
If there are any kids in the audience, don't get any ideas.
Yeah, I don't recommend that technique.
In the climate change, which is...
That doesn't exist.
No, well... impacts of perhaps a changing climate. Let's refer...
The city I lived in for 47 years just burned down, but other than that...
Ramping up, and yet it feels like a lot of people are starting to backslide on commitments. I mean, do you think our big picture messaging isn't cutting through, or
I think it has.
How do you smack everybody into shape?
You're familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the famous psychologist, and the 5 stages of death, right? First one is denial, then there's anger, then bargaining, then depression, then acceptance. So I think we skipped the part where you fight back, and we went right to depression and acceptance, right? Unfortunately. So, to me, what I'm seeing is that I think everybody believes, whether they deny it or not, I think we're not in denial anymore. We're not in the stage where we actually don't believe the facts. I think we're in the stage where people do believe the facts. The only way we're going to get through this is to start to see ourselves as one tribe. One tribe, and we're only going to solve this all working together. Hardest thing, human beings are terrible at it. They're terrible at protecting their immediate tribe. They're very, very bad at spreading that tight spotlight of empathy to the rest of the world, right? So we create in-groups and out-groups. My in-group is more important than you guys, and if you die, bummer, right? And we've got to evolve beyond that. I mean, that's really the next threshold for us. If we can do that, if we can extend that spotlight of empathy out to people we don't know their names, they don't look like us, and they don't talk like us. If we can't do that, we're not going to make it, because the only solutions are global solutions. We've got global problems. We need global solutions.
That's a perfect note on which to end. Let's all work together and be friends.
Exactly. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, everybody. This has been fun, right? Okay, all right. Thanks.